Next up, we have Conkeldurr. Believe it or not, Bulbapedia says it is based on ogres. Therefore, Conkeldurr is officially the Shrek of Pokemon. It's basically Shrek crossed with a construction worker and a clown. Perhaps Shrek going into construction with a side gig as a clown will be the plot of Shrek 5, especially since Gen 5 was the generation in which Conkeldurr was introduced. Indeed, Gen 5 introduced many new Pokemon that were similar to those in Gen 1, and Conk was the new Machamp. It was also one of Elite Four Marshall's dangerous Pokemon, and man, it hit hard. Today, we're going to examine if Conkeldurr's presence in the competitive scene was as many layered as the onions it enjoyed. And so, we ask, how good was Conkeldurr actually? And in this video, we'll be going over these competitive formats. Conkeldurr received a significant amount of hype at the start of its debut generation, and saw a ton of usage as a result. At first, it lived up to the hype, with enormous attack and HP stats alongside a solid physical defense, Drain Punch to hit hard and keep it healthy at the same time, and a powerful stat priority Mach Punch to keep the metagame warping Sandrush Excadrill and the massively threatening Terrakion in check. Conk was a defining Pokemon of early Black and White. With Bulk Up, it made itself even stronger while softening the physical damage it would take. Damage it healed off even more easily thanks to the now boosted Drain Punch. Conk sliced through the popular Ferrothorn Jellicent combination with ease, and couldn't even be slowed down with status, as Guts would just power it up even further. It also had the option of a substitute Focus Punch set alongside its alternate ability, Iron Fist, but that was generally more gimmicky. The Bulk Up set was far more reliable, and was thus the standard that defined Conk's place in the metagame. It was quite dominant and difficult to deal with for many teams. Sadly, this dominance did not last. As powerful as Conk was, it also had many significant shortcomings that became more apparent as time went on. Its low speed and poor special bulk was highly exploitable given the amount of strong special attackers running around in the tier, especially with Rain in the picture. Drain Punch wouldn't keep it healthy enough to circumvent this, especially in Sand, and its priority Mach Punch wasn't going to fix the issue, as it didn't do much of anything against Rain Sweepers, Sun Sweepers, and Latios. Conk also struggled to break through common defensive teams, as it was just walled by so much. All of Gliscor, Slowbro, Reuniclus, Quagsire, and Skarmory staved it off without much trouble. It hung on for a while since its Mach Punch was valuable in staving off the absurdly dangerous Excadrill, but once Excadrill was banned, Conk's usage careened off a cliff for the rest of Black and White 1. Then Black and White 2 came around and Conk saw play again. It received Ice Punch, meaning Gliscor could no longer wall it, nor could the new Landorus. However, Bulk Up sets hated choosing between it and Payback, as being completely walled by Jellicent was asking for trouble. Running both Payback and Ice Punch was viable, but not running Mach Punch just further exacerbated Conk's issue of low speed. The Bulk Up set wasn't what brought Conk back to life though. After Tornadus Therian was banned, some players began exploring another option gifted to Conk in Black and White 2, its hidden ability Sheer Force, which powered its Ice Punch up further while allowing Conk to run Life Orb free of recoil, and did the same for Thunder Punch. This meant that Conk now easily plowed through would-be walls in Skarmory and Slowbro. Drain Punch and Mach Punch would still proc Life Orb recoil, but they loved the power boost. Alternatively, Conk could run Iron Fist on this set, which meant it would always take Life Orb recoil, but would also power up its coverage punches while strengthening its stabs further as well. This set was incredibly difficult to switch into for nearly every team, especially as Conk used speed investment that allowed it to outpace Skarmory and mauled nearly everything defensive. It didn't bring much to the table defensively, meaning it wasn't too easy for a team to fit, but on an offensive Volt Turn team with good pivots against the faster Pokemon that threatened Conk, it could go into the slot normally occupied by something like Terrakion and proceeded to wreak havoc once it was afforded a free switch in. It was a small niche and required support, but it was a niche nonetheless, and a dangerous one at that. Conkeldurr finished the generation a far cry from its early days of dominance, but no player would underestimate it. They knew that if they wanted to set up Stealth Rock with Tyranitar, they would allow Conk in and risk losing a Pokemon to it outright. Listen, VGC 2011 was an all-out slugfest, a down-and-out brawl, a frantic fracas, a no-holds-barred battle, by which I mean to say fighting types were good, like really good. Terrakion, Scrafty, Mienshao, all strong fighting types with different strengths to bring to the table. Just take a look at the world's top 8 teams for the year. Scrafty and Terrakion were common sights on many teams, and even Mienshao and Emboar made some appearances. But if you were looking for a bulky Trick Room fighting type that could function in Trick Room, Conkeldurr was undoubtedly the way to go, as you can see on the teams of both Wolf Glick and the world champion Ray Rizzo, who chose to actually bring 2 fighting types to Worlds. Scratch that, Wolf brought 3. Conkeldurr's strengths in Trick Room are obvious. Its massive attack stat meant it brought more raw firepower to the table than any other fighting type, and it was able to circumvent its low speed outside of Trick Room with Mach Punch. Guts let it absorb status, while Flame Orb sets would often be losing health. Drain Punch kept it topped off and hard to take down, an incredible quality in a metagame that started to trend towards bulkier sets as time went on. If you wanted more power, you could run Hammer Arm, especially since the speed drop was actually a benefit in Trick Room against opposing Conkeldurr or slow mons like Amoonguss. Most sets finished the attacking slots off with Rock Slide, one of VGC's most ubiquitous moves and an essential tool against flying types, but Earthquake and Payback were other viable coverage options. The last move slot usually went to Detect instead of Protect, a subtle optimization against potential Imprison strategies, but some players also made use of Conkeldurr's access to Wide Guard to shore up their team against spread moves. As you might expect, Conkeldurr's biggest enemies were the other defining part of VGC 2011, the Genies. Tornadus and Thunderous had to fear Rock Slide, but their high speed and type advantage were a big threat to Conkeldurr. Amoonguss also posed a pretty big problem, and bulky psychic types like Masharna or Reuniclus were also effective counters. Conkeldurr was pretty predictable, but hey, if you can know which way a truck is driving, you should still probably get out of its way. Trick Room was a niche playstyle though. Scrafty was the more popular fighting type for its access to Fake Out and ability to take over games with Moxie, as well as a much sought after Dark type to handle those pesky psychic types. Terrakion was also a very common pick, chosen for the power and speed that's always been its hallmark. Conkeldurr found his most season-long success alongside Wolf, who committed to the style for his victories at both DC Regionals and Nationals, as well as his Worlds run to 6th place. Wolf used around the same strategy in all of his teams, even though they had slight differences. He put bulky Trick Room setter and attacker in the front, Kafagrigus and Scrafty, then brought the heavy hitters like Conkeldurr or Reuniclus in the back. His teams and sets varied slightly between tournaments at Regionals. His Conk had a standard moveset but with leftovers. At Nationals, he changed the item to Koba Berry for the Genies, and at Worlds, he went Guts and dropped Rock Slide in favor of the more reliable Facade. But Wolf wasn't the only Conk player with some anti-Genie tech. That distinction, of course, would go to world champion Ray Rizzo. Much has been made of Ray's numerous metagame-defining adaptations and optimizations at 2011 World, and his Conkeldurr was no exception. In the finals, Mateo Genie was in for a rude surprise when he attempted to dispatch Ray's Conkeldurr with a Tornadus Acrobatics, only to find that Ray had specifically EV'd his Conkeldurr to live acrobatic with no flying gem. With that baby optimization, as well as a whole host of other innovations and a lot of good Pokemon play, Ray made Conkeldurr a world champion in its first year. It's a good thing that Ray got conked that piece of hardware fast, because the expansion of the Pokemon list in 2012 was not good news for Conkeldurr's medal-winning aspiration. 2012 brought back the bulky Psychic type to end all bulky Psychic types, Cresselia, as well as other problems for Conkeldurr like Latios and Salamance's Intimidate. Conkeldurr did get access to Ice Punch as a way to handle those Dragon types, but its biggest problem actually came from its fighting type brethren, who offered Conk steeper competition. Hariyama was the most direct comparison, as it brought similar bulk and still offered Guts power and priority, but also could offer Fake Out support to a team, a huge utility advantage. Hitmontop meanwhile didn't have quite the same bulk and power, but brought even more utility in its combo of Intimidate, Fake Out, and Sucker Punch. Remember how we called Conkeldurr a truck? Well, these trucks were Transformers, bringing utility in addition to power, and poor old Conkeldurr just couldn't keep up. But in 2013, Conkeldurr learned that it didn't need to do anything fancy if it just added some extra horsepower. Don't get me wrong, 2013 had even more power in the metagame, but Conkeldurr just matched up to that power, thanks to the mid-season release of its Dream World ability, Iron Fist. While Conkeldurr was now vulnerable to burn, it had the potential to spec into even more power than before. Running Iron Fist and Life Orb for a level of power that guaranteed its hammer arms would absolutely obliterate anything that didn't resist it, making Conkeldurr the single most powerful single-target physical threat in the metagame. By Nationals, people were starting to catch on to its power, and Scott Glaza used his Life Orb Conkeldurr to land an 11th place finish. Other players didn't go for Life Orb and instead were just happy not to have to sacrifice HP for power, such as Adib Alam, who used a Lumberry set to finish one place above Scott at 10th. Adib also entered into a long tradition of tailoring Conkeldurr's IVs very specifically, giving it 8 speed IVs to still outspeed Paralyzed Choice Tyranitar while underspeeding other relevant threats in Trick Room. We'll cover a few more optimizations like this later on. Conkeldurr's rise also coincided with the release of a metagame-defining threat that it just so happened to synergize with incredibly well: Eruption Heat Heatran. Eruption Heatran was an event-only mon that came from Power Ranger Guardian Signs, and while you don't need to know anything about that game, what you do need to know is that it was locked into a quiet nature, aka a speed dropping nature. Since this moveset relied on not getting hit before firing off your eruption, this Heatran only really functioned on Trick Room, aka Conkeldurr's favorite environment. If you had any doubts about how good that pair was, take a look at the world's top 8. That's 3 Conkeldurr Heatran pairs in the top 3. Aaron Zheng, Ryosuke Kosuge, and the first ever European World Champion, Arash Amadi. The Heatrans were actually pretty different between the 3. Aaron and Ryosuke ran quiet eruption, while Arash opted for a fast bulky set. But wait a second, I'm not here to talk about Heatran. I'm here to talk about Conkeldurr. Aaron actually built his team around Conkeldurr, drawn in by the immense power it presented, and ran a very standard set of Life Orb with Hammer Arm, Ice Punch, Mach Punch, and Protect. His stat spread was pretty simple, as most Conkeldurr sets are max attack, put the rest in bulk. Ryosuke's set was actually very similar, with only a bit more physical defense to set it apart. Ryosuke actually used this Conkeldurr for pretty much the entire season, with a first place finish in the Japanese Nationals and a silver medal at Worlds. It's hard to argue with its efficacy. But Arash's Conk stood out. Take a look at Arash's team. This is not a Trick Room team. While Aaron built this team around Conkeldurr, Arash picked it as the last mon in his team, using it as the glue to hold it together. Conkeldurr had quite a few tasks, beating Sand, rounding out a defensive core, and being a good counter to Trick Room teams. But since Arash was aiming for a Conkeldurr more geared around versatility and bulk than offensive power, his Conk had very different specifications. Instead of Hammer Arm, Arash went back to Drain Punch, and instead of full attack investment, he only had 32 EVs in that stat, and there was no Life Orb here. True to his plan to keep Conk around, Arash went for Citrus Berry instead. This was a bulky, hard-to-kill Conkeldurr, designed to stick around a long time and disrupt the Pokemon that would otherwise be problems for his team. As you might have figured from the World Championship, it worked out perfectly. Conkeldurr was an essential member and ended up being the Pokemon Arash brought most in his World Championship run. People may remember the Mamoswine, but this uniquely geared Conkeldurr was a pretty impressive strategic accomplishment, one in the legacy of Rays from 2 years earlier, and responsible for getting the Fighting Type 2 World Championships in its first 3 years of existence. Sorry, did I say 2 World Championships? Let me correct myself. 3 World Championships. Yes, Conkeldurr didn't win Worlds in 2012, but Cybertron wasn't the only Zheng brother to bring Conkeldurr to Worlds in 2013. Brendan Babytron Zheng also brought Conkeldurr, and while he did spec 252 attack EVs, he walked the same path as his fellow champion Arash, forgoing Life Orb and Hammer Arm for a set with more sustain, bringing Lumberry Drain Punch. Now, Conkeldurr couldn't quite win Senior Worlds for the Triple Crown, but Marcus Liu did manage to secure 3rd place. Here's a great stat to demonstrate how great Conkeldurr was in Gen 5. No other Pokemon won 2 Master Worlds titles in the generation. Brendan's gold medal was just the cherry on top of a standout debut as for the generation's defining fighting type. The 6th generation's Assault Vest seemed tailor-made for Conk. It preferred to spam attacking moves anyway, and it loved the special defense boost, which made it much more difficult to KO. It was also far more irritating to switch into thanks to a buff knockoff removing leftovers. It was one of the most popular Pokemon in the early days of XY, helping stave off Genesect in particular, while checking other notable threats like Bisharp and Mega Tyranitar. However, it didn't take long for Conk to completely fall out of usage. The 6th generation also brought Fairy types, and they were completely ruinous for Conk, namely the mighty Clefable. It didn't help that Conk also struggled to take on most Megas, such as Venusaur, Scizor, and Charizard Y. It was a popular choice among less experienced players, thus preventing it from dropping to UU immediately, but it saw no usage in high-level play. However, this didn't last. A little over a year and a half into ORAS, Conkeldurr finally dropped to UU. It wasn't too notable at first, but then Salamence was banned, and without it around, Conk's viability and usage skyrocketed. Its Assault Vest set was solid, with the special defense boost letting it take on Tier King Hydreigon, and with Guts allowing it to turn the tables on many of the Tier Scald users. But what really established Conkeldurr as a dominant threat was its Choice Band set with Iron Fist. Sure, it had to be warier of status, but it was well worth the effort, as its stunning strength made it nearly impossible to switch into safely. Even max defense Florges could be straight up KO'd by Poison Jab with Rock Sub, while Alomomola got utterly plowed by Hammer Arm. In addition to being a fierce wall breaker that rips through just about everything, its super boosted Mach Punch helped it against fast faster offensive Pokemon too, as it bypassed the issue of its low speed. It did 51 to 61% against Mega Aerodactyl and 61 to 73% against Infernape. It didn't just use this set though. Anyone who tried to thwart the Iron Fist set with a burn would be in for an unpleasant surprise against the Bulk Up Guts set. All it needed was one turn of safe setup, which wasn't hard given how many staple Pokemon like Empoleon is scared out, and it would turn into an absolute tank nearly impossible to take down, healing off hits with boosted Drain Punches and picking weakened Pokemon off with boosted Mach Punches. The flexibility to switch between moves as needed was wonderful. Sure, Floor just countered it, but it would be forced to take a knockoff, thus losing its leftovers and making it susceptible to getting worn down by Stealth Rock and good switching, meaning Conk could outlast it given how many opportunities it get with all the Pokemon it threatened, and eventually it'd be able to break through. It could play similar games against another counter in Crobat, games which were even easier given the Bat's Stealth Rock weakness, as being able to run two incredibly powerful, completely different sets added depth to Conk's game. It could really run most anything and play whichever way it wanted, whether it aimed to slowly break its counters down or simply crush them outright. The player base attempted to adapt their efforts so as to curb Conk's enthusiasm for destruction, but you know what they say, can't donk the conch. Yeah, that's a real saying, definitely. Conkeldurr was utterly dominant to the point of absurdity. In fact, throughout its tenure in the tier, many top players considered it broken, though it was never put up for a ban, until after many years of protest. Well after Generation 6 was no longer the current generation, a vote was finally put together. Conkeldurr was banned with a resounding majority, the player base's distaste for it as clear as day. Conkeldurr was one of the most powerful, definitive Pokemon of ORAS UU, completely warping the tier around it in such an extreme way that despite that extended delay, eventually got it banned. Conkeldurr was so absurd that it caused a shift in the tiering policy. At one point, past generation lower tiers were locked, so they wouldn't be affected by OU tiering processes. This is how, for example, Dugtrio was banned from DPP OU, but still allowed in DPP UU. However, Conk's ban was such a necessity that this policy was re-examined specifically for it. The unlocking of old gen lower tiers was beneficial for them in general, but Conk led the way for them. It pretty much beat ORAS UU into submission until the rules changed. What a generation for it. Fairy types were just as big of a problem for Conkeldurr in doubles as in singles, and while it could poison jab them, it was hard to justify using that slot for such a specific move. Conkeldurr's entire place in the metagame changed going into Gen 6. Because 2014's rule set required the Pokemon to be from X and Y, Conkeldurr lost access to its elemental punches and Iron Fist, and aside from the systemic changes, there were quite a few new Pokemon that posed pretty big problems. Talonflame was an obvious issue, but Conkeldurr especially struggled with Aegislash. One of Conkeldurr's prior strengths was its ability to blast through steel types, but when that steel type is also a ghost type, that strength just flies out the window. And speaking of steel types who can beat fighting types, let's talk about Mega Evolution. Any Pokemon's place in the Gen 6 metagame was unavoidably defined by how it matched up with Megas. For Conk, it was a mixed bag. Mega Mawile, Megazard, and Mega Gardevoir posed very big problems, but it could hit really hard against the Mega that defined most of 2014, Kangaskhan. However, that damage was dependent on being able to hit first, which is not Conkeldurr's specialty. It did have a new tool for survivability in Assault Vest, but Trick Room was not an especially popular metagame call, and with so many Pokemon that could do heavy damage to Conkeldurr around, it only made its mark on a few regionals top 8s, such as Tony Chiung's 3rd place in Salem and Ben Demian's 8th place in Seattle. Conkeldurr had a few top 16 appearances at Nationals, but no top 8s. But I do want to very quickly shout out Huey Ha's National set, though not because it placed 26, but because of Huey's innovations. Safety Goggles and Superpower were cool, but Huey also made a neat speed IV call, as with 14 IVs and an adamant nature, he guaranteed that he could underspeed Aegislash outside of Trick Room to hit it with his surprise payback. Conkeldurr would see some similar IV optimization at Worlds, where Colin the Battle Room Hare managed to take a Mon that had been outperforming all season to 3rd place. Colin had the same slow payback tech for Aegislash, though his calcs were based on underspeeding Blade Form Aegislash after it had been paralyzed by his Zapdos. Colin ran an especially bulky AV Conkeldurr, reasoning that bulk was the best way to handle Kangaskhan, especially if Conk could heal up with Drain Punch. Colin says that Conkeldurr was the weirdest Pokemon on his team because it was really chosen to handle specific threats like T-Tar, Mamoswine, and Lucario, but with its naturally good matchup against Kangaskhan and Assault Vest Guts to deal with Rotom forms, Conkeldurr had a place on the team to deal with some of the most common threats in 2014. Luckily for Conkeldurr, 2015 restored its access to a slew of tools, including the Elemental Punches, Iron Fist, and the newly buffed Knockoff, which gave Conkeldurr a more reliable answer to Aegislash. 2015 was also a curious time for good Turtle Conk. It's impossible to talk about Conkeldurr without talking about Mega Kangaskhan, whose strength was metagame defining. Conkeldurr's matchup against Kang was pretty good, yes, but Kang and Mawile and Landorus Therian made for a metagame centralized around neutralizing physical attackers with Intimidate and Burns running amok. Conkeldurr certainly didn't like Intimidate, but Burns weren't the worst thing in the world. Iron Fist may be strong, but the prevalence of Will-O-Wisp led many players to stick with Guts, ensuring that Conkeldurr could tank Burns for their teammates and still put out huge damage. Items were often Assault Vest or Citrus Berry, though there was a pretty big debate on which was better. At the end of the day, both Citrus Berry and Assault Vest were additional survivability, but with slightly differing breakpoints for their best usage. Case in point, Aaron Taylor won the Mississippi Regionals with a Citrus Berry Guts Conkeldurr, leading the charge into 2015, and went on record saying that he thought Assault Vest was terrible when Conkeldurr had the ability to use Wide Guard for additional utility. Conkeldurr put up multiple good regional performances across the world. Shoutouts to Colin Hare for pairing with it successfully again, as well as fellow top 8 performers Ryan Brooker, Cristiano Garcia, Jan Sim, Simone Perilli, Luis Alfonso Trujillo, Ruben Ulysses Lintz, Joshua Perry, Kimo Nishimura, Nick Safranik, Cameron Swan, and Toller Webb. To give you a better idea of the divide in sets, Jan Sim took 5th at the UK Regionals with an Assault Vest Iron Fist set, and then Alberto Lara used Guts Citrus Berry to win Utah Regionals right after that. The cherry on top, Alberto originally was using Assault Vest, but it was Trailer's team report about his Mississippi team that changed his mind. Conkeldurr continued to perform on a national level, with Francesco Pardini taking home top honors at the Italian Nationals and 2 top 8 finishes at US Nats, courtesy of Hayden McTavish and 3rd place finisher Blake Hopper, who used Assault Vest Iron Fist, proving both sets were truly viable in top play. Blake also opted for Rock Tomb, a tech to reliably handle Charizard Y matchups that were more doable with the Assault Vest in the first place. Unfortunately, Conkeldurr fell out of favor just as Worlds rolled around. If you know VGC 2015, you know that the Chalk archetype dominated 2015 top 8, and while there were few Conkeldurrs just outside that top 8, including former world champion Arash Almaty, Conkeldurr was unable to break into a final day spot. Conkeldurr fared very poorly in 2016, where its power simply wasn't enough to match up to Primals. If you were running a fighting type in 2016, you wanted more utility, and the answer to that would always be Hitmontop. Conkeldurr was even worse in Gen 7 OU thanks to the influx of fairy types, but that was just fine because it compensated by wreaking absolute havoc upon UU. Gen 7 had nerfed burn damage from 12.5% to 6.25%, making Conk's Flame Orb set ridiculously difficult to deal with. Previously, it had never used status orb sets because the residual damage would pile up too quickly, but that was no longer an issue. It was taking paltry damage every turn and would easily outheal it with its Guts boosted Drain Punch, which slammed neutral targets. Conk's most spammable move was actually not even Stab, it was Facade, which was not only its strongest move against a target neutral to all of its moves, but also creamed nearly every type that resisted fighting. Flyers, fairies, poisons, and bugs were all destroyed by it. Facade was ridiculously strong, and players were not exactly thrilled with the prospect of switching resistant Pokemon into it, as Rocks and Steels were completely destroyed by Drain Punch. It wasn't just enough to be able to withstand one Facade either. The Pokemon switching in would also have to be able to survive the follow-up Mach Punch, which made the task of switching into Conk go from massively difficult to nearly impossible. Sure, ghost types were immune to both normal and fighting, but they were far from safe as they were utterly mauled by Conk's knockoff. It basically had choice band power on all its attacks while being able to switch moves, and all for the measly cost of minimal damage it could easily heal off. Conk was ludicrously dominant and was so arduous to handle that it had an unhealthy influence on the metagame as a whole. As a result, it was the first suspect test chosen by the player base, and to the surprise of absolutely nobody, it was banned with resounding certainty. Now, this did mean that Conk was doomed to languish in the limbo of borderline, as it couldn't hope to establish any sort of OU niche, and no one was keen on it ever returning to UU. However, it could be seen as Conk fulfilling its destiny from the previous generation. It was considered broken, but was just barely questionable enough to where it didn't get banned, so it returned with a vengeance, ensuring that there were no two ways about it. It was absurdly broken, easily the most brutal thing in the tier. So overall, this can be seen as a successful venture for Conkeldurr. Gen 7 was chock full of horrible problems for Conkeldurr. It wasn't allowed in 2017's Alola Dex format, but it might as well have been banned from 2018 as well. On top of a Tapu-dominated metagame, Conkeldurr was incredibly vulnerable to common Intimidate cycling strategies that dominated the metagame. A good type matchup against Incineroar looked a hell of a lot worse than when Landorus and Salamence were helping drop your attack to -2 or -3. If you were going to bring a physical attacker, it needed to be something that could circumvent those stat drops, aka Belly Drum Snorlax, a beast boosting Kartana, or a clear body Metagross that could Mega Evolve afterwards. Conkeldurr's attack stat and access to Mach Punch kept it popping up in minor special events and other small tournaments, but the fact is undeniable. One of Generation 5's most impressive Pokemon had been reduced to an afterthought. With a significantly slashed Pokedex, Conkeldurr returned to OU prominence at the beginning of Generation 8, brandishing its vicious Flame Orb set once again. It received an incredible buff in the form of a new fighting stab, the one and only Close Combat, whose astronomical power alongside Guts allowed it to plow through Corviknight. The metagame's fighting resist didn't want to switch into Conk either. Toxapex and Aegislash were crushed by Earthquake, while Clefable was absolutely hammered by Facade, especially since they ran max special defense in order to stave off Hydreigon. This meant that Facade had around a 12.5 chance to outright KO a full health Clefable. Now, it didn't happen often, as Conk usually wouldn't want to risk it one-on-one, but on the rare occasion it did, it was a satisfying sight to see. Its powerful Mach Punch was also capable of keeping Galarian Darmanitan in check, and once G-Darm was banned, it was still good for Hydreigon. Sadly, just like Conkeldurr's other times in OU, it didn't last long. Its low speed was just too much of a burden. It was far too easy to prey on its low speed and special bulk by playing around it with Pokemon like Dragapult, Rotom Heat, and Togekiss. Plus, Clefable started running physical defense again. Clefable couldn't withstand 2 Facades or anything, but it had a much easier time pivoting in. In theory, Conk could still be threatening, but it took a lot more work to extract value from it, and it quickly significantly declined, dropping to UU as soon as the tier came into existence. And it was booted out almost instantly, as it was thoroughly impossible to switch into and effortlessly ripped the entire metagame to shreds. However, it couldn't hope to return to OU, since its old problems still existed, and before long, it also had better competition in the far faster, more reliable physical attackers that appeared when Rillaboom and Cinderace received their hidden abilities. Why struggle to get anything done with Conk when you could effortlessly spam these two for better results? The constant expansions were generally bad news for Conk, as eventually Magearna was also available, and Conkeldurr basically vanished from everyone's minds. It dropped to UU again during the Isle of Armor, and basically repeated its performance from the initial stage of the tier. It more or less outclassed Terrakion, and to do that is a great feeling for any fighting type. It didn't get to do it for long, as it was once again banned almost as soon as it dropped down owing to its utterly obscene power, but that was just another point in its favor, the perfect illustration of its capacity for shattering any and every Pokemon in the tier. Then came the Crown Tundra, and with the Pokedex expanded again, this allowed Conkeldurr to rejoin UU without completely breaking it. Not only that, but for the first time, Conkeldurr actually struggled in UU. Make no mistake, its Flame Orb set was still utterly terrifying to switch into, and was thus an absolute nightmare for defensive teams to handle, as they provided it many opportunities to batter away at them again and again. Buzzswole was one of its best checks, especially if physically defensive, and it did usually get the job done, but it sure wasn't ironclad. It couldn't take repeated Facades with Stealth Rock, since knockoff would remove heavy duty boots or leftovers, or even potential chip from Rocky Helmet. If it was going to be switching into them over and over and over, and Conk wasn't exactly getting worn down thanks to the minimal recoil of Stealth Rock and bird damage easily being recovered by Drain Punch, as well as the fact that it easily hit the field without taking further damage thanks to the effortless pivoting capabilities of its switch move packing teammates. Plus, Conk loved Wish Support from Jirachi for even greater longevity. This is what led to Conk reigning as one of the biggest threats of the early Crown Tundra metagame. With such easy entry from all the U-turns, Volt Switches, Flip Turns, and Teleports, even the prominence of popular fighting resist in Primarina and Salamence didn't deter its brutal knock into Facade antics, while another common fighting resist that also resisted Facade, Aegislash, was deathly afraid of knockoff. However, as the tier developed, it moved in a direction that proved less than favorable for Conkeldurr. Yes, it was one of the most obscenely difficult threats for bulky teams to handle, that remained true. The problem was that the tier as a whole was far more than just slow, bulky, passive teams. In fact, the tier was quite fast overall, with the teams Conk feasted on not being nearly common enough to justify running a Pokemon who was pretty much exclusively good at destroying them and little else. Indeed, Conkeldurr struggled when such large portions of opposing teams consisted of Pokemon that were faster and could deal heavy damage to it. Its opportunities were severely limited, and it'd go 1-for-1 at best. This isn't necessarily a deal breaker in and of itself, but the problem was that there were several other fighting types in UU who did not have this problem. Pokemon like Mienshao, Keldeo, Como-O, and offensive Buzzswole were not as out and out destructive as Conk against bulky teams, but still threatened them plenty, and were also much better against the metagame as a whole thanks to their speed, or in Buzzwole's case, superior defensive capability, which included acting as an effective check to Conkeldurr itself. This is why these other fighters were among the best Pokemon in the tier themselves, while Conk was relegated to more niche wall-breaking territory. It was still a legitimate threat, but more of a specific Pokemon than ever before. It was pretty much solely used to crush Stall, which resorted to Galarian Weezing to try and check it, but that really just showed how helpless they were, since even with neutralizing gas neutering Conk's guts, Conk was so strong that Galarian Weezing still got hammered by Facade. However, only being useful to destroy Stall was a far cry from the beast that had shaped and destroyed entire metagames Conkeldurr had been prior. Conk was to stay in this position for a while. Eventually, UU went through some massive changes. Buzzwole left the tier, its users having moved up to OU. Conk losing both fighting type competition and one of its best checks was already a major boon for it, but that was far from all. Excadrill, Hydreigon, Slowking, and Mandibuzz all dropped into UU, providing several new top tier Pokemon which Conkeldurr absolutely destroyed. The metagame shifted to a focus on regenerator cores, with Slowking pairing up with a Moongus or Tangrowth, often backed up by bulky Pokemon like Skarmory, and Conkeldurr tore through them effortlessly. Its demolishing act wasn't limited to the slow and bulky either. Its Mach Punch smashed through many of the popular fast offensive Pokemon as well. In addition to the aforementioned Hydreigon and Excadrill, which was already huge, it loved destroying the likes of Zarude and Mamoswine as well. The player base recognized Conkeldurr's destructive potential for this new metagame, especially during Latias's foray into the tier, and Conkeldurr's usage shot up as a result. Conkeldurr was so destructive, in fact, that a significant portion of the player base were calling for its ban. Again, it was incredibly hard to stop. Players were resorting to running Galarian Weezing on non-stall teams for the sole purpose of slowing it down, which was as unreasonably specific as it was imperfect. Conkeldurr was on the cusp of a truly incredible feat, getting banned from UU 3 times in one generation. However, it came up just short. Once again, the metagame shifted from its slow, bulky focus and grew more offensive, centering around other defensive threats like Thundurus Styrian and Salamence. Conkeldurr struggled to keep up with this shift and couldn't replicate the absurd success of the incredibly broken Mienshao, whose great speed let it terrorize this faster metagame. Was Conkeldurr doomed once again to fall into relative obscurity? Thankfully, no. Mienshao was banned, and Conkeldurr was able to find a balance between hyper-specific stall killer and overpowered metagame destroyer. Sure, it struggled to keep up with common fast-paced offensive threats like Volt Turn, but it was a solid choice to ensure that almost no matter what, one's team would not struggle with bulky tactics where it remains today. And so Conkeldurr had one destructive roller coaster of a Generation 8. Generation 8's initially limited Pokedex was just what Conkeldurr needed to become relevant again. Conkeldurr found quite a bit of success in the early days of Gen 8 VGC, when it served as an incredibly potent counter to the Togekiss, Excadrill, Dragapult teams that cropped up early in the meta, as well as other excellent teams utilizing Tyranitar. Togekiss may have been the most popular Pokemon in the format, but an Assault Vest could let Conkeldurr tank some hits and still do significant damage with Rock Slide or Thunder Punch. Rock Slide especially was valuable since it bypassed any redirection. Most Conkeldurrs used some combo of Drain Punch, Mach Punch, Rock Slide, and some form of coverage, whether Thunder Pulse for Gyarados and Zard, or Ice Punch for Dragapult. Conkeldurr also really appreciated the heavy metagame presence of reliable Trick Room setters like Dusclops and Mimikyu. And while it wasn't always the best user of Dynamax itself, the way Drain Punch interacts with Dynamax health means Conkeldurr could really keep itself topped off in certain scenarios. Conkeldurr made its first appearance in the first season of the Korean League, where players like Jungkyu Choi and Song Young gave it top 8 finishes. Francois Xavier Laganeste took it to its first podium by getting third in Bochum with a Flame Orb set that emphasized power, and things only continued up from there. At Dallas Regionals, Justin Ramirez finished 5th place with Conkeldurr, and both runner-up Binji Wang and champion Aaron Trailer had their own Kongs as well, with wildly different sets. Binji's was reminiscent of Conkeldurr's of old, updated for the modern era. 14 speed IVs, Flame Orb Guts, Mach Punch, Drain Punch, and Thunder Punch, clearly designed to be a Trick Room attacker. Trailers, on the other hand, was designated to work in either the Trick Room or Tail Room modes on a team that he had developed with Wolf Glick and Justin Karas, and opted for an Assault Vest set with 3 different fighting moves, adding in close combat to pick up guaranteed KOs on Dynamax T-Tar and put out damage when it really needed to. Conkeldurr followed up Dallas with a stunning performance at the Melbourne Internationals, where it once again saw 3 top 8 appearances and a gold medal, this time courtesy of Italian Marco Camantha Caladura Silva, who used a Flame Flame Orb Gutset with Ice Punch. Conkeldurr continued to show up all through Series 2 of VGC 2020, performing well at Collinsville, Malmo, and Perth regionals, and even into the transition online, where it was a frequent sight in Victory Road challenges, Rose tournaments, and the Galar friendlies. That success continued into Series 3, where a good matchup both with and against Lapras led to such results as Alex Gomez's second place at the Players Cup Invitational. Assault Vest plus Aurora Veil ratcheted Conkeldurr's bulk up to a new level, and Iron Fist Drain Punch was still nothing to scoff at, especially if you were healing HP behind screens. Conkeldurr's crowning achievement came on a Lapras team just like this, where Febzy Oakon managed to win the Online Champions Cup hosted by WolfClick and A-Drive, to this date the largest Pokemon tournament of all time. Febzy went all in on firepower, running a Life Orb Iron Fist build that could deal out massive damage from behind Auroraville. After a long time iced out from the spotlight, Conkeldurr had finally claimed another title on a massive stage. However, that might have been its last shot for quite a while. As more Pokemon became available and popular in the meta, Conkeldurr fell out of favor. Incineroar Intimidate cycling was back, Primarina gained favor, and moreover, other physical attackers started to heavily outclass it, including Grassy Surge Rillaboom and a new fighting type in town, Urshifu. Conkeldurr's usage fell off a cliff after the Players Cup victory, and it hasn't seen a resurgence throughout all of Gen 8. It's likely it'll see any play as we see Sword and Shield Swan Song tournaments with Gen 9 on the way. Conkeldurr's gotta hope for a limited dex meta where it can flex, because as we've seen time and time again, the biggest muscles in old times eventually just look like pea shooters when you compare them to the new guns in town. And that's it. So how good was Conkeldurr actually? Well, of the 4 generations it's existed in, it's been hyped up in OU at the beginning of 3 of the 4, only to fall out of usage before too long. However, it has also quite a storied career in UU. It was incredible in ORAS, dominating the tier to the point of getting itself banned. It was then banned again in Gen 7 and managed to do it twice in Gen 8, even threatening to go for a third. However, as the metagame progressed, Conkeldurr's finally established itself as a non-broken and has even taken quite a hit in the fast-paced, fighting-heavy metagame. However, it still remains a threat. So overall, Conkeldurr has gone up and down in OU, much like the cinder blocks it lifts, but it's the most terrifying UU Pokemon of all time. And as far as consistently terrorizing the tier and getting sent to BL is concerned, it's not too far behind Staraptor. So all in all, Conkeldurr has had one excellent competitive career. Thanks for watching, everyone, and as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content, and in the comments, I want to know, what do you think about competitive Conkeldurr? How would you buff it to make it stay in OU? Whatever it is, let me know in the comments. Also, thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos, and thank you to everyone else watching as well. And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.